Myths and Waters with your host, Bud Levitt.
Our topic this evening is water, something that we have in a great amount in the state of Maine. A year ago in this series of programs, Paul Atwood, a brewer, made a remark in passing during one of our interview programs that down the road, Maine would finally recognize, as well as all of its citizens, that the most precious resource that we have is a thing called water. Fascinating topic, and hopefully tonight you'll know more about it. Paul is again our guest this evening, and we're going to discuss a thing called water. Paul, right off the bat, are there any myths with respect to water?
There are lots of old wives' tales and a collection of myths that the population keep about water. I spent some years in a land damage board state outfit hearing the cases on water, and I thought at the time when I got done, after 14 years of hearings, that I knew more about water than anybody else in the state of Maine. Of course I didn't, but then there's a theory that water is in veins, much as pipes are laid down under the world. We had one fellow down on Route number 4 in York County, had a farm, and he claimed the state shut off the water in his well by cutting a road across his property. And he said the water came down from the White Mountains in these veins, and they came around his house and his barn and across his garden and down into a bog, a flowage in front of his house, and up across the road and into his well in the pasture. And his well went dry right after the state built the road. Well, I said, can you explain that? And he said, certainly. You see, what we're living on is much like a billiard ball. That's a round mess. He said, I don't know what it is, iron or rock or something, but it's just like a billiard ball, and on top of that is all the topography we understand, like the lakes, the mountains, and everything are on this ball. And between the two, these veins of water. And the great pressure of these mountains force the water through these veins. Well, I said, your farm is north of the road, and your well is south of the road. How come that vein got cut off? Well, he said, down in this country, all veins run from north to south. I said, is that so? And he said, yes. And why is that? And he said, because they have to get to the water has to get to the ocean. Therefore, it all comes there. And I thought that's rather remarkable. I'd never heard that one before. Till I got down in Perry one time on Route number 1. We had a case there. Man down there said that his well went dry because the state built a highway in front of his place, and that they cut the vein off and his well. Well, I said, you mean it went from west to east? And he said, that's right. And I said, why did the vein go from west to east down here? He said, it has to get to Passamaquoddy Bay. And I thought, well, that's 2 in a row. Perhaps there's something to this. And I waited till I get up on Route number 1 off near Fort Kent. We had a case up there. A fellow up there said that his well was cut off and the state built a road across his property and severed the vein in his well. I said, how do you know that? What way was it going? He said it was going northeast. Well, I said, how come that vein of water goes northeast up here? And he said, it has to get to the St. John's. So that's one of the myths, that this vein water in the soil is on top of this great dome we live on, billiard ball. And he said the pressure of the White Mountains over in the number 4 case drove the water down there. And down in Perry, they said the pressure of the mountains over north of Perry and over on the airline that kept the water going towards Passamaquoddy. I thought it was rather remarkable.
How does it flow?
Heavens, no, I think it goes every way.
Do you?
There are veins of water in the soil, there's no doubt about that. And but I've heard all wells collapsing because the state built a road across it. We had one fellow in South China. He said the water in South China, the well water was under the vein water was under the bottom of China Lake, and the great pressure of China Lake forced that water in veins across the road 100 feet uphill under the state highway and up back of his house and his barn, and finally when they built the highway his well went dry. And I said, well, what do you suppose did it? And he said, well, the vein was cut off by the state. And well, I said, and you're suing the state for $1,000 for loss of your well? He said, that is right. I said, Mr. So-and-so, if you had a neighbor next to you on the north side and a fence there, and he dug a well right in that fence, and suddenly your well went dry and he got all the water he needed, what would you say? He said, I couldn't say anything, he's my neighbor. Well, I said, you've got several neighbors live down in front of you on the state highway, the people of the state of Maine. They're your neighbors, and they dug there down there 6 feet on the road, and you assume that shut off your vein of water. Well, I said, they're neighbors of yours too. He said, I understand it, and he dropped the case right there. We won that one. But there are all these myths about water, and the state's full of them.
How about the fellow that goes out with the alder crotch and makes a determination where there's water?
They'll work.
Do they?
Oh, sure. And I can show you some samples of it up to Leonard's Mills. We've had that sort of treatment up there, and one of the best witch seekers in the state was up there and looked it over. And there's no doubt there's water down there. To contradict the whole theory, most people say there's water everywhere. If you dig long enough, you'll find it. But there isn't water everywhere. There's some areas and some soils that there's no water in. The water will appear on top of it, but there won't be any veins under it, as they say. Of course, water does run in veins, but because it's not in pipes, it flows through the soils.
Well, why would a state like the state of New York, even with New York City, with all its peoples and the surrounding territories, why would they be so short of water?
It's just too many people using water at 175 or 200 gallons a day per person. There just isn't enough in the whole watershed to keep them. They have to go beyond that. They go to Delaware to get their water, and they pipe it down into a series of ponds and lakes and finally into New York City. And they're always out of water down there. And the same thing's happening in Massachusetts, and those lakes above Boston and over towards Springfield. They're tapping those now, and they still haven't enough water for Boston. And we're going to have the same situation here if our coast ever prospers as it has in other places, and we get large enough population.
How do they get water, for example, up in New York and some of those streams into New York City?
They bring it down in large tubes or pipelines and into some central place where it's aerated and finally put into the system. Croton Reservoir at New York City is the last one, I believe, before the water goes underground into the city. But and on the West Coast, they have a tremendous job out there. San Francisco and those cities there are always crying for water, and they're picking it up now in the Colorado River, and all the western mountains are supplying them with water, and they still don't have enough because they're cultivating up those valleys and raising vegetables there, and that takes a lot of water.
You mentioned Croton, New York. Some great fishing streams up there. In days gone by, I know you did a lot of fishing up in there.
On the headwaters of Delaware, the Willamette and the Nevesinks. And they were good trout fishing.
Well, they still are great and productive streams for
brown trout.
Right,
now.
a lot of brown trout.
Yeah.
But did it affect the fishery in any way at all when they started moving the water into New York?
I never heard that it did. There was still good fishing up there long after they got the water into New York, so I don't think it bothered at all. I think the fishing is upstream above the water source.
A year ago, as I said at the outset on this show, you mentioned that it was our greatest resource. Do you foresee the day when we will be piping water to the heavily built-up areas right out of the state of Maine?
I think it's only a matter of time before they'll have to. And we'll be sitting on the lifeblood of the cities on the coast because we have the water up here. I think you'll see the day when waters like the Suncook will be being piped down to the coast to use on the people down here. They'll have to because we won't get enough rainfall down here to take care of it. And those great reservoirs in Piscataquis and Aroostook County are really assets. And of course the second asset is the timber that takes care of them and replenishes them and holds the watersheds. You have to have both together, but I think the biggest asset is the water.
Recently, you made a study of the Penobscot River, and all the way from Eddington to Bradley. Tell us a little about the history of that great river, as it was known in those days as the Great River.
Well, about 1700, around 1790, so forth, the survey was made, and the farmlands of 100 acres each were lotted off. Park Holland was one of the original surveyors that came from Massachusetts to do the work. And he laid out a series of lots starting at Eddington Bend and went up to the village of Bradley. And I think there were 23 lots all told, and 10 of them now in Bradley, and the rest are in Eddington. At that time, I abstracted the properties for these different settlers, and by 1805 or 6, I had them pretty well settled as to who owned what. And there was a curious thing in there for the salmon fishermen. There was one fellow on lot number 5 in Bradley who conveyed the right to salmon fish on his shores, and he was the only one that mentioned salmon fishing.
He gave riparian rights.
Oh yes, he gave right to go out there and build traps or fish off from his property. It was 100 acres, lot number 5 in Bradley. And now belonged to a man, I think the name is Webb. But his predecessor granted a deed to somebody to use the shore of his farm for fishing.
And who was a Mr. Blackman?
Blackman was the leader of the family. He came in there in about 1818, and they survived in the valley and operated Leonard's Mills until 1880. At that time, they pulled up all the stakes and went west out to California and Washington. First mayor of Snohomish was Blackman.
Really?
Oh yes, and they went out there. They took their know-how how to cut timber and moved out to the west coast.
Well, who was Mr. Nichols?
Nichols was one of the first settlers of VZ. Settled it right around where the bend is now, Eddington Bend, and the pond at what is now called Chimo was known as Nichols Pond.
Nichols Pond.
And the stream out of it, which is now Blackman Stream, was called Nichols River at the time. The old maps call it Nichols River. And Nichols was a pioneer. I understood he came from Ireland. He married several times and had a total of some 14 children, according to the records that I've had access to. And he was quite a carrier. Up in the river above the bend, there's a rock, a large boulder. It's now known as Nichols Rock. And the survey of the Indian Number 4 Township, which was undertaken by Park Holland and his crew, started at Nichols Rock in the Penobscot River. And you can find it. There's a small brook that comes in up on 178.
Yes, sir.
A few feet up the road, perhaps 300 or 400. And that rock is opposite the mouth of that brook.
Well, did Nichols use that rock as kind of a, well, a signpost to plot all that land all the way to Chimo Pond?
No, I think Pac Holland, when he was running out the number 4 township, you see we had 4 Indian townships on the river. There was 1, 2 was on the Bangor side, and 3 and 4 was on the opposite side. And number 1 started from Bangor and went north up to Alton and Argyle. You came across to Greenbush and on number 3, and down on number 4 was where now Bradley and Milford, Bradley, and part of Eddington were number 4. And those lands were conveyed to the Indians by Massachusetts as a settlement for treaty. And then in came the settlers started to possess their lands and cut their timber and build dams on the things. And the Indians didn't like it. They appealed to the court of Massachusetts, and they sent up a whole boatload of surveys. As a matter of fact, there was 3. There was a Chamberlain, a Holland, and one other, I don't remember his name right now. And they came up and started running out the Indians' land to find out whether or not these settlers were encroaching on the Indians' land. Huh. And they were. And the court of Massachusetts bought the lands and gave them to the original settlers for settling there. That's how they got in. They were mostly New Brunswick people.
Well, wasn't there a town treasurer who had a nice knack for picking up land?
Oh, that was Mr. Blackman, the first Mr. Blackman. And here in 1834, he was elected town treasurer of Bradley.
Of Bradley?
Bradley. And one of the selectmen and treasurer. Those days, if you didn't pay your taxes, they gave you a tax deed for your land. And every time there was a tax deed, it wasn't paid on, say, $10.43 or whatever was due, all he'd do is call up one member of his family and say, hey, I would like to buy 100 acres of land in Bradley for $10.43. Will you pay the tax and show us? And they'd give him a deed. And the first thing we know, the Blackman family, Mediate family, and heirs of this fellow owned about 5,000 acres in the town of Bradley.
Right along the river or going back as well?
All back and everything. Anything that had a dam site on it where you could saw wood and the last Blackman that was 1874 or 5 was Adam Blackman, one of the original Blackman's son. And Bradley Blackman was the originator. He got the town named after him, the stream after him, the town named after him.
Okay, and that's how the stream got the name Blackman Stream.
Bradley Blackman.
And Nichols apparently was the reason behind naming...
He was a predecessor of Blackman. He was one of the early settlers of the river lots along Eddington Bend. And Nichols came over to this country and settled there, and he apparently was a well-known fellow. He even got a rock in the middle of Penobscot named for him, Nichols Rock.
That's right above the... Well, you mentioned, I got to bring you back to Chimo here. What's the problem out there with respect to water levels?
Well, in 1929, after several years of low water in the pond, the utility which supplied water for the town of Orono and Brewer found that they didn't have any water in their mains. And in an emergency, they went down to the outlet of Chimo Pond at that time and built a barricade across the bottom of the tom. It's a small dam, concrete dam, about 50 feet long, 22 inches wide, and about 4 feet high at its greatest height. And that was enough to impound about 1/10 in vertical distance, the pond. And that kept water in the mains of Orono and Brewer. It wasn't put in on any scientific reason. They just put it in there as an emergency so they wouldn't be out of water for firefighting purposes. So The result of all that action was Chimo started falling. The main dam, the Leonard's Dam, built in 1790 odd, was breached, and the water was gradually falling down in Chimo. And they built this barricade, or so-called roll dam, to offset the low waters they had. There's nothing to hold it in there, it was running out. I've seen Chimo down to nothing but a drizzle coming through the stream. And it's commonplace to see the stream downstream between Leonard's Mills bone dry. You can walk across it without getting your soles of your feet wet. And it's those periods, and if it hadn't been for the dam that had been in there, that was put in there, which was a replacement for a natural dam, there was an escarpment at the foot of Chimo, and it's still there in greater part. And the early builders of the dam took out part of that escarpment, and they built the dam of what they took out of the escarpment. The ledge was mined right there. They had a quarry right there. And they built this dam that you put a gate in, and for the purpose of holding the water for sowing in the middle of summer. As the water in the pond dropped down, they could raise the gate and still get water to sow with. Now that was the purpose of the dam. It was never there to create the high water of Chimo.
Well, as I understand it, you're being ordered to take the present dam that you've constructed at Leonard's Mills down 4 feet. What will this do to the main lake?
It'll drop Chimo about 2 feet below its level, at least 3 or 4 feet below where it should be. See, these ponds have a natural high and a natural low. And the high water mark on Chimo was etched on the shoreline. You can see it out there most of the time. And the low water mark is not etched on the shore. It's right now, it's that roll dam that was put in. There are lots of people out there who consider that's low water, that dam, that roll dam. It has nothing to do with low water at all. I think Chimo, left to its own devices and its own annual runoff rain, will be a lot higher. We've been at the mill, Leonard's Mills, we've been trying to hold Chimo at 1/2 of its normal level. Mm-hmm. And we're in trouble for doing that, because we do that, we don't leave any shores uncovered with water.
Will this all be grass on the outer edge of the pond?
It's going to be. It's getting
Eelgrass?
that way now. It'll be eelgrass and needlegrass and whatever grows out there.
What happens to Chimo Bog?
Well, Chimo Bog is going to drop 2 feet too if they change the pond. And if she goes down 2 feet in elevation for low water in Chimo, Chimo Bog is 7,000 acres, a natural sponge up there, is going to go down 2 feet too. Now, Chimo Bog just feeds two things. It feeds Blackman Stream all summer long, part of its runoff, and the other half is Great Works Stream. Mm-hmm. Bradley used to be known as Great Works. Great Works Stream comes into the Penobscot at Bradley, and its source is Chimo Bog. And if you lower Chimo Bog, 7,000 acres of bogland, wetlands, down 2 feet, I'm wondering what's going to happen to Great Works Stream.
Well, this really doesn't take into account anything from natural rainfall, a natural raise and lowering of water, does it?
No, it drains out all the natural rainfall that comes in summer storms, rather than holding it. You see, the high water mark on most ponds, great ponds in Maine they call them, is determined by the natural elevations that come from spring freshets. The average of all the spring freshets is etched on the shoreline, either in soil washed away, tree roots exposed, or rocks. If you go to a pond like Phillips, you'll see on the granite boulders out there, you'll see the high water mark etched. The lichens are all disturbed, and you can see it there. This same thing happened on all the ponds, and unless one of these ponds is allowed to fill up to its natural elevation and drop down to its summer level, whatever that is, it's in trouble. It gets polluted. And if the summer level is 0 or down to within 1/10 of full, you've got nothing but lots of polluted water coming down there and nothing to flush it out. Where if you had a pond half full, you've got some semblance of regulation on the water quality. And Chimo has got so many camps around it now and so much pollution going into it.
A lot of pollution?
I think there is from the septic tanks that are too close to the water. And they say that one of the reasons that they want beaches in front of the camps is because years ago, when most of them settled there, they said, well, when we came out here some years ago, there was a beach in front of this place. Now you fellows have kept the dam up so there's no beaches anymore. What they're talking about is the pond was down so low you could see the bottom. And these mud flats, they call beaches out there. There's only one natural beach on Chimo that I know about, and that's on the southwest side. That's a storm-made or naturally made beach. The rest of Chimo, the only beaches there, when you drain the water down to nothing, and you show the bottom of the pond, that's what they call beaches. So these people that claim that we kept the water up, saying we're destroying the beaches.
Well, I'm sorry, but we have to leave it there. We've consumed the best part of 1.5 hour. Well, until we meet again, I'm Bud Levitt, wishing you a good evening. My guest has been Paul Atwood.
I love to wander by the stream that